This video is going to look at the biological explanations for schizophrenia. And on your specification, there's three things you can get questioned on: the genetic explanation, the dopamine hypothesis, and neural correlate. So you've got to know the AO1 and the AO3 for these three different areas. So we're going to look at the AO1 first. Genetic explanation suggests that schizophrenia runs in families. And it's a really hard thing to get evidence for because families tend to share aspects of their environment. So it's really hard to distinguish, is it a genetic cause or is it an environmental or social cause when we're looking at genetic studies. There is one very famous study in this area, and if you're going to talk about genetics in an essay or an answer, you want to bring in Goatsman's study. And this was a meta-analysis of 40 different European studies. And this allowed him to calculate the concordance rates for relatives of a schizophrenia sufferer. And it showed a really strong relationship between genetic similarity and the shared risk of schizophrenia. This graph shows the results of Goatsman's study. So you can see here that general population have a 1% chance of developing schizophrenia. If you have an auntie or uncle who has schizophrenia, your chances to develop it increase to 2%. If you have parents who have schizophrenia, your chances increase to 6%. If you have a brother or sister who has it, you increase to 9%. If you've got a non-identical twin who's got schizophrenia, there's a 76% chance, or 17% chance, sorry. And if you are an identical twin, and your identical twin has schizophrenia, there's a 48% chance you are going to develop it. So you wouldn't need to bring all these into an answer. As long as you mention the general population 1%, identical twins 48%, it's clearly showing that there is a genetic link between developing schizophrenia. Okay, so genetics is potentially one explanation for the disorder. Some researchers suggest that schizophrenia is polygenic. You should remember this word from last year when we looked at OCD. Then this means that there's a number of different genes involved and different combinations of genes work together to potentially develop schizophrenia. Ripley suggested that there's 108 separate different genetic variations that are linked to an increased risk of schizophrenia. So that means there's 108 different combinations of genes that can work together in order to bring about the disorder. And this includes genes that affect neurotransmitters such as dopamine. And this leads us now onto the dopamine hypothesis. So the dopamine hypothesis is one of the most widely accepted explanations for schizophrenia. And it states that dopamine works differently in the brain of schizophrenics compared to normal individuals. And there's a few different theories relating to the role of dopamine. One of them is that they have excess amounts or larger amounts of dopamine in their brain, and that brings about positive symptoms such as hallucinations and delusions. So increased levels are linked to the positive symptoms of schizophrenia. It's also been suggested that they have a high number of dopamine or D2 receptors on receiving neurons. So this higher level of receptors will result in more dopamine binding and therefore more neurons firing in their brain, which is linked to more hallucinations and more delusions. If you look at the diagram here, it shows that usually what would happen in someone's brain. But in a schizophrenic, they'd have higher levels of dopamine, so these little neurotransmitters here. They'd have higher levels of dopamine, and they'd also have higher numbers of dopamine receptors. So they might have increased numbers of dopamine receptors on receiving neurons, so that more of these neurons can keep firing. The action potential carries on down the neuron every time. And it's that increased neuron firing rate that increases the number of hallucinations, increases the number of delusions that a schizophrenic individual would have. The dopamine hypothesis doesn't just look at excess amounts or larger amounts of dopamine. It's also suggested that lower levels of dopamine might be linked to the negative symptoms. So higher levels of dopamine linked to the positive symptoms, lower levels are linked to the negative symptoms. but only in certain parts of the brain. So it's been suggested that in the prefrontal cortex of the brain, that lower levels of dopamine will be linked to things such as speech poverty. And you see the PET scan down here at the bottom, and it's shown that in the prefrontal cortex of schizophrenics, they've got much lower levels of dopamine than a normal individual. In addition, animal studies have been done where they've depleted the amount of dopamine in rats in their prefrontal cortex. So they've reduced the amount of dopamine being produced in the prefrontal cortex of their brain, and it's resulted in negative symptoms such as memory loss. So there is a link, higher levels, lower levels, but dopamine does seem to be involved in the development of schizophrenia. So you can see two brains here and the red flashing images. This first image here is the levels of dopamine in a normal human brain. So you can see little flashes of red everywhere. But in this second diagram, where we've got lots larger amounts, you can see the elevated amounts of dopamine in the brain of a schizophrenic patient. And again, that might be specifically related to the amount of D2 or dopamine receptors that that individual has. The final biological explanation that you've got to know for your exam is neurocorrelates. And this links to the structure and the function of the brain. That the structure of the brain correlates with certain experiences. And it's been found that there are certain neurocorrelates for the negative symptoms of schizophrenia. So the negative symptoms, remember, speech poverty and avolition. And avolition has been linked to a certain part of the brain called the ventral striatum. And this ventral striatum is abnormal in schizophrenia patients. And some people have also found that there's also lower levels of functioning in this ventral striatum and this certain part of the brain compared to normal individuals. So you can see this ventral striatum correlates to schizophrenia developing. So there's also neurocorrelates for positive symptoms of schizophrenia as well. So Alan did a study and scanned the brains of auditory hallucination patients. Remember, people that hear voices. And he found that there was lower levels of activity in their superior temporal gyrus. So it's one specific part of the brain, their superior temporal gyrus, compared to a control group. And again, using PET scans, using MRI scans, using CAT scans, researchers discovered loads of neural correlates for schizophrenics. And things such as the ventricles, or sort of holes in the brain at the most basic level, and the cavities in the brain, they have much larger ventricles and much larger cavities in their brain compared to control groups and normal individuals. For example, certain people have found that these cavities in the brain can be 15% larger in a schizophrenic patient than a normal individual. So let's look at the A1. We've looked at genetics, we've looked at the dopamine hypothesis, we've looked at neurocorrelates. And now we're going to start to look at the evaluation points for these different explanations. So the main study to support the genetic explanation of schizophrenia was conducted by Canarian, and he looked at all the adoption studies conducted in Finland. And what he found was that children of schizophrenia sufferers were an increased risk of developing schizophrenia, even if they were adopted into a family with no history of schizophrenia. So it shows there must be a biological cause, it must be genetic, it's been passed on from their parents. So even if they were brought up in a family with no history of schizophrenia, they were still at an increased risk of developing the disorder. Other studies have looked at concordance rate, so pulling all the data from all schizophrenia twin studies, and they found that the concordance rate for monozygotic twins was 40.4%, and for dizygotic twins only 7.4%. So clearly, because monozygotic twins are closer in genetics, there must be a genetic explanation, or at least genetics plays a role in the development of the disorder. Right, so we had a look at two studies, and we've got overwhelming evidence to support the role of genetics. But because it's not 100%, the fact that if you have a monozygotic twin, the other twin gets it, it's because that concordance rate isn't 100%, it must mean there must be other factors. It can't just be explained by genetics alone. So the higher concordance rate in monozygotic twins, for example, could be explained by environmental similarities. So the fact that monozygotic twins or identical twins are treated very, very similar because they look similar, whereas dizygotic twins are treated almost like two different individuals. So that treatment might explain the occurrence of schizophrenia rather than genetic. And that's where we start to get this idea that it's probably genetic vulnerability that's passed on rather than genetic certainty for schizophrenia. So the research for the dopamine hypothesis generally relates to drugs and drug treatments and taking of drugs. So if you look at amphetamines, these are called dopamine agonists because they increase the dopamine levels in the brain. So any amphetamines of speed, cocaine, will produce can produce schizophrenia-like symptoms in non-sufferers. So someone takes cocaine, they could experience things like hallucinations and delusions. So it shows that dopamine must play a role. The increase in dopamine levels is linked to these positive symptoms of schizophrenia. On the other hand, you've got antipsychotic drugs. So people who are schizophrenic often take antipsychotic drugs. And what these drugs do is they reduce the dopamine levels in the brain, they reduce the activity and block the activity of dopamine, and are very, very effective. So this clearly shows that both of these drugs are demonstrating the important role that dopamine plays in schizophrenia. And new research has started to look at even more neurotransmitters. We're now looking at serotonin, glutamate, to try and see the effect of these neurotransmitters on schizophrenia as well. A study in 2013 looked at 212 studies in a meta-analysis, and what he looked at was comparing the effectiveness of antipsychotics compared to placebos. And all the antipsychotics that were used were far more effective than the placebos for both negative and positive symptoms. And this was because they all helped normalize the dopamine levels in the brain. So like we've already learned, the antipsychotics reduce dopamine levels. So clearly, again, this shows the important role that dopamine plays in the development of this disorder. So there is further support for the dopamine hypothesis when we look at the dopamine activity in Parkinson's disease. Parkinson's sufferers generally will have lower levels of dopamine activity in their brain, and they often take a drug called L-Dopa, which will increase the levels of dopamine. However, if too much L-Dopa is given, then the Parkinson's patients will start to show schizophrenic tendencies. They'll show the hallucinations, they'll show the delusions that are associated with schizophrenia. And again, it shows that dopamine must play a role. If someone's dopamine levels increase too much because of this drug, then they start to show schizophrenic tendencies. However, there is contradictory evidence as well. Noel looked at antipsychotic treatment for drugs and found that in 1/3 of the people that take them, it doesn't actually alleviate or treat any of their hallucinations. So he also found that hallucinations can occur in people who have normal levels of dopamine. So there must be other neurotransmitters that play a role. Some people can't be treated with their dopamine. Some people have normal levels of dopamine, yet they get hallucinations. So there must be other neurotransmitters out there. Like I said, we're now looking at serotonin, we're now looking at glutamate as possible other causes for schizophrenia. So the final explanation we're going to look at for the biological explanation of schizophrenia is neural correlates. And there is evidence to support this from Sudha, who've looked at MRI pictures of the brain structure of monozygotic twins. So one monozygotic twin had schizophrenia, the other didn't. And what they did was they put an MRI scan of their brains to check for the brain structure. And what they found was that the schizophrenic twin generally had far larger ventricles and a reduced anterior hypothalamus. So like we said before, those cavities in the brain were much larger in the schizophrenic twin. And the differences were so clear that from these MRI scans that 12 out of 15 pairs could quite easily be told which was the which was the schizophrenic twin. So if you have a look at this picture here, this would be the results, some of the results from this study. And you can see in the unaffected twin, relatively small ventricle, and the largest ventricle in the schizophrenic twin. So you can clearly see the difference. It shows that brain structure must have an effect on the development of schizophrenia. However, we can't reliably establish cause and effect. This can be applied to neural correlates, to the dopamine hypothesis. You can sort of adapt this however you want for your essay. You could use an example. Does brain structure and changes in brain structure cause schizophrenia, or does schizophrenia cause changes in the brain structure? We can't be clear on which causes which. And alternatively, there could even be a third factor that influences brain structure or the symptoms of schizophrenia. So this really reduces the neural correlates and the dopamine explanation because the evidence is inconclusive. Not being able to reliably establish cause and effect is a big, big issue. Again, you can throw in your reductionist paragraph. This ignores any psychological factors. Any things like family dysfunction, the cognitive explanation, it ignores all of those. So you can use that reductionist paragraph as part of your essay. Finally, the theory is also determinist. Okay, if an individual has higher levels of dopamine, does that really mean they're going to go on and develop schizophrenia? Really, in real life, we know people have free will. People have some control over their behaviour. And this is something that the biological explanation of schizophrenia tends to ignore.